Greetings, Padawan. We are going to talk about Uncle Walt Whitman, one of the most colorful characters in American literature. Probably the first colorful character in American literature. You thought it was Edgar Allan Poe, but it's not. Walt Whitman is the last of our writers that we read. He takes us, not personally, but his work is the last work we see before the American Civil War. So he was born in New York. He is quite a character. He's called the father of free verse because that's how he writes his poetry. He's called the bard of democracy because he writes a lot about the democratic institution and democracy as itself. And his most famous work, Leaves of Grass, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is considered an American epic in the same sort of vein as Dante's Inferno or the works of Homer. Some fun facts first before we talk about Leaves of Grass. He quit school at the age of 11 because his family, his father had lost his job and they needed money, so he left school and he was self-taught and he became a teacher at 17. And what's interesting about that, or what's ironic about that, is that Walt Whitman didn't think that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare's plays, and there's actually a huge debate about this if you don't know. I don't believe Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare's plays either. But the reason that Whitman gave for thinking that Shakespeare didn't write his plays is that he said that somebody who was uneducated and not of noble birth couldn't possibly have written those plays. That's a little ironic, seeing as he left school at age 11 and he became America's bard poet, like Shakespeare became England's bard poet. He has all the markings of a romantic. He celebrated the self, he celebrated nature, he celebrated the natural world, he was a transcendentalist, he was, Emerson was a huge fan of his and helped promote his work and helped promote Leaves of Grass, which we'll talk about. And, so he has all the markings of a romantic writer, and he's a colorful character. So this is the guy who will show up at your house nude. He would just show up at his friends' houses wearing no clothing because he celebrated the body. And he felt that that our puritanical views on clothing were outdated and separated us from God. So he took it upon himself to show up naked. He was an editor for over and a writer for over 15 publications. One of them is Life Illustrated, which is still in circulation today. But he would often get fired from these jobs because he was just so outspoken and so colorful. There's a huge debate about whether he was gay, straight, or bi. There's no evidence of any of those, actually. But he writes a lot in Leaves of Grass about sexuality, which was a taboo topic at the time, and we could argue still today. That sexual imagery almost prevented him from being published. And in fact, the publisher in Boston that was supposed to publish Leaves of Grass, one of the editions of Leaves of Grass, didn't. He actually was going to sue Whitman because Whitman made the edition look like a Bible, and that was sacrilegious. So Whitman just went to Philadelphia and had it published there. He wrote, like, for us being as bad boy like Lord Byron, who he liked a lot, for being as bad boy as Lord Byron, he was also like a health nut. He was, like, it's funny that he and Poe, who were like these, like the bad boys, they were all like health nuts. He was really into physical fitness, Whitman was. And, but he wrote his fitness tracts under a pen name. So he had work that he associated with Walt Whitman, and then he had work that was associated with these other characters he had created. He wrote a temperance novel. So remember, there was the abolition movement to prevent the sale of alcohol, and he actually wrote a novel about a guy who tries to give up drinking. And then later in his life, he was a little bit ashamed of that because it was a free spirit. But at the time, that's what everybody was writing, and he was younger. He was friends with Bram Stoker, and if you know anything about Bram, he is the writer of Dracula, and some say that Whitman was the inspiration for Dracula. He met and may have kissed Oscar Wilde. When he was a child, he met Lafayette from the Revolutionary War, and he had given him a kiss. And then probably his most notorious personal thing is that his brother had been injured in the Civil War, so Whitman went to the hospital to help his brother, and then became a nurse because he saw the overwhelming need for medical help. And so he stayed on, even though his brother was better. He stayed on and then wrote about conditions in the hospitals. So he's an interesting guy. So in his wellness tracks, one of the funny things that he writes is that he considered beards to be a barrier to germs. So all of you who have beards or know people with beards, tell them that Walt Whitman would be very proud. And one final note about him, he designed his own tomb, and if you want to go visit it, he was born in New York but lived most of his life in and out of Jersey, in Camden. So he is buried in Camden, New Jersey, and you can go visit his tomb, and people leave pennies there because Whitman was a huge fan of Abe Lincoln, and Abe Lincoln is on the penny. So let's talk about Leaves of Grass. I want to make sure that I don't miss any of my cool notes about Leaves of Grass because it's such a good work. So the first note is that Leaves of Grass, the title, does not mean what you think it means or anybody else thinks it means. So a little bit of trivia for you. So the way that he used words, he played on words a lot in Leaves of Grass and in other works that he had. So leaves actually means pages. So leaves of a book, pages of a book. So leaves means pages. And the way he used grass in the slang term was like grass was like inconsequential or like, non-important. So technically, in his eyes, leaves of grass actually means pages of crap. So funny little footnote there. Of course, down through history, we don't think about that. So let's talk about the themes of Leaves of Grass. So it started off as 12 poems, just 12. It's now more than 400. He just kept adding to it. Why? Well, Emerson really promoted his work, and so it was instantly successful because like Emerson was like, the father of American Romanticism and Transcendentalism. So anything that, that Ralph said to read, people were reading, so people read him, and so he just kept adding poems to him. And but it started off as 12. So that's important to know. And so there are lots of editions got reprinted and republished as he added more poetry to it. And so we had lots of dealings with different kinds of editors. If we boiled everything down to 3 themes, and I would caution us to do that, but just to make it easier for us, there really are a lot of themes within a theme. But if we boiled it down to like 3 kind of major themes, one is he's celebrating his own individual identity. Right? He's celebrating the self, his self, song of myself, right? He's not singing the song of anybody else's self. He's singing the song of himself. And so these writings are a celebration of his soul, what he called the divine soul, which he believed we all had, and that they all work together. So he was talking about his personality, his individuality, and that's really the core of the work. He's also talking about democracy and sort of a eulogy on American democracy and really talking about its potential and what it could be. Right now, remember, he's writing this on the cusp of a civil war. So he's like encouraging, like, this is what democracy could be if we could get out of the way. This is what it should be. And he believed democracy was best executed in the hands of the common people, not with politicians, not in the legislature, but in the hands of the common people. And then a third part of it is just about the cycle of life and who God is, the nature of God, and birth and death and regeneration, resurrection, and sort of this cycle of life and this and that nature and God are one, and that the cosmos is God, right? That the universe is not static, that the universe is God, and that it's a vibrant, pulsating, living entity. And so sort of all of the constructions, and really we have to think about the time period, right? So he was a nudist and he would just show up at people's houses nude. Imagine that, right? Imagine that today. Your buddy just comes over and is naked, right? You'd think he was, had lost it, right? But think about that in the 1800s, right? So women, just think about what women had to wear. And this is middle class up through upper class, right? A corset, multiple skirts, a hoop skirt, things that covered your wrists, things that covered your ankle, nothing could show in your body, right? Because we still had that Puritan way of looking at the body. Even though we had denounced the Puritans, we still dressed like Puritans, right? So Walt shows up to your house naked, right? It is a huge break from social societal expectations, right? And then he's talking about the ego, right? How he's celebrating himself when, even though we've left that Puritan behind, we still have this idea that we can't celebrate our achievements. We can't talk about the good things that we've done. And so contemporary critics to him, and even critics now, will say that he was, very egotistical. And but he wasn't talking about just himself. He was talking about how we all, we're all given gifts by God, and we're all, individuals, and we should celebrate those things that make us individuals, because then we'd be a stronger body to do good in the world, right? But revolutionary thinking at that time. So he felt the self was both physical and spiritual. So your body, you should celebrate your body, and things like desire and sexuality, those are constructs. We've been told they are bad, but they're not bad because they're of ourselves, and so they are good. And so you should be, exploring yourself, right? Masturbation is a good thing. Sexual relationships are a good thing. There's nothing wrong with sex. Sex is not evil. We've made it evil, right? Often critics have confused the divine soul, what he calls the divine soul, with egotism, but he's talking about all of our individual, things that make us unique, that they're all good. One of the reasons that Emerson liked him, and I often wonder what Emerson thought about all the sexual stuff, because, New England isn't known for their sexual prowess or their independence in that regard. But Emerson did like his, Whitman is, the last of the transcendentalists, and he believed that nature was God and God is nature, and that time, past, present, and future is a human construct. Time itself is actually fused together. Like time is all fused together. And so Emerson really liked his work and promoted it. Whitman believed in a cosmic consciousness, that the universe is not dead, the universe is not stagnant, that the universe is God and God is the universe. And things like death and decay are human constructs, that we attach sadness and evil to them. They're natural parts of life, and they make way for the rebirth of something new. He was considered a mystic. So mysticism varies depending on who you're talking to, but in relationship to him, things like evil, that's not real, time's not real, all that God and man are fused together, that's real, right? And we have God within us, and we release God into the world. And then again, he wrote a lot about democracy and the potential of democracy and what we could do. He was anti-slavery. He was anti-alcohol sales, apparently, at some point. But he talked about, he really was a champion for the democratic spirit, and what he saw the potential for America to be, which is interesting given that he's writing on the cusp of a war. So then he goes into the war. He witnesses firsthand the brutality of war. If you know anything about Civil War history, you know that, they're throwing limbs out the window, and, there isn't medicine to put people out when they're cutting limbs off, and the blood, it was, very gory. Our wars now are often, launching stuff from here and hitting people over there, so you don't see firsthand the victims on either side. And so he writes about that, and then after, during the Civil War, we don't see a lot of writing, but then after the Civil War, we begin the realism period, where people are writing about the aftermath of war, but also the Industrial Revolution, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and there's definitely, a class struggle. So I hope you enjoy the writings of Walt Whitman. I hope you enjoy the parts of Leaves of Grass that you'll be reading, and that you think about who he was in the time he wrote that stuff. I mean, he could be writing that stuff today, and it would make a lot more sense. But when he's writing it, it really was very controversial, and he was considered obscene. And so I think he's fantastic, and I hope you think he's fantastic too.